Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Things I Can't Explain. My name is Casey, and I am so super excited that you guys are here. If you're watching this video right here on YouTube and you enjoy my content, I would appreciate it so much if you would subscribe to my channel. I will also be linking my social media in the description box so you can follow me on Instagram and TikTok. And also, this video is available in podcast format, so you can listen to it on Spotify, iHeartRadio, or Amazon Music. Tonight's episode is a little different from my previous episodes. I was doing some research and I was looking for a story that I could really kind of deep dive into and do a lot of research on that sort of had a case built around it versus short stories that I was reading in last week's video. Now, I came across some stories that I didn't originally plan to combine into one video, but the more I was researching, the more I realized that I couldn't stop thinking about these two stories sort of side by side. Now, these stories are from completely different places with different families in entirely different decades, but they both sort of kept circling the same idea. Now, I personally had never heard of either of these cases, but apparently they are popular stories. I figured though, if I hadn't heard of them, maybe some of you guys hadn't either. And I also don't really hear people on social media talking about them. So the first story is the true story of the Black Monk of Pontefract. And then the other story is the Battersea Poltergeist. Now, both of these stories, the families in these cases believe that they were dealing with poltergeist. But once you really sit with both of these stories, you realize how both of them are less like a coincidence and more a pattern. At first, they don't seem related at all. One story is definitely more violent physical attacks on the family, and another story is more about actual physical communication with the family. But after I was really thinking about both of these stories, I realized something that kind of freaked me out. And it is neither of these stories felt accidental. It didn't feel like the family moved into this house and that entity just happened to be there and they were wrong place at the wrong time. As both of these stories sort of escalated, it felt like these families were specifically being targeted by this poltergeist or entity, and that it really wanted them to know it was there. The other similarity that I noticed is in both cases, once this entity was acknowledged, it just kept escalating. And it didn't stop when other people were watching. In both cases, there were neighbors, friends, witnesses, and these experiences that were happening inside the homes would still continue. So when you can bring in multiple people and they are all experiencing the same thing, I think that's when it just gets a little bit freakier. But without further ado, let's get into the first story. This first story takes place in a very small town in England called Pontefract, in a incredibly normal home. This was not a home that was isolated somewhere. It was in a regular neighborhood with houses around it, with neighbors. There was nothing tied to it to make people think that something unsettling was going to happen in this house. No deaths or any creepy experiences. It was a very normal, tiny home. A woman named Jean Pritchard moved into this home with her two children. She had a daughter named Diane, who was 12, and a son named Philip, who was 15. And as far as I can tell through my research, she was a single mother, and it was just the three of them in this house. Now, right off the bat, moving in, there were a couple kind of weird things that were happening, but nothing that would immediately point to there being an entity or a haunting. So the first thing that Jean noticed was in her living room, she kept seeing and finding what looked like a very thin layer of white dust, and she described it almost like chalk dust. Now, sometimes when she was in the living room, she could physically see it coming from the ceiling, but without any sort of reference point as to where it was coming from. But it would kind of rain down the ceiling into the living room. Now, there were no cracks, there was no construction going on. There really was no reason for this to be happening. But of course, your first logical thought is this is an old house, and I'm sure there's some sort of logical explanation, some type of repair that needs to happen. Now, at the same time, while this was happening, Jean was also noticing puddles of water appearing on the floor seemingly out of nowhere. And again, she didn't immediately think that this was something supernatural, but she was a little confused, of course. There was no pipes leaking or anything like that, but she did figure it was an old house. She also assumed that maybe one of her kids was making a mess and not cleaning it up, or they didn't want to own up to it because they didn't want to get into trouble. So she wasn't really thinking too much of it. Now, I'm not sure the exact time frame of when these events were occurring, but pretty quickly after the chalk dust and the puddles on the floor, things started to ramp up a little bit. And that's when the kids were also starting to notice odd things in the house. Now, the family could be in one room, and like I said, it was just the three of them, and doors in another room or on another level of the house would slam shut pretty violently and aggressively with no one anywhere near them, no windows or doors open, no drafts blowing through. There was a dresser that would have drawers opening and closing violently and aggressively over and over repeatedly, just opening and slamming shut on their own. And then furniture started moving, and it was very heavy furniture, and it wasn't sort of just like moving just a little bit or very subtly. The couch would slide across the floor. Now, once they started hearing the noises and the furniture was moving, of course, this led them to believe that something crazier was going on than this just being an old house that might need repairs. But again, they still weren't quite sure what was happening and not really sure what to do. And then things escalated even more. The daughter, Diane, was sort of the first one to kind of experience physical attacks from this entity, and she would describe being in bed at night and feeling something physically grab her ankles and drag her out of her bed. Now, she could never see what this was. There was never anything in her room, but this was happening night after night. Something would grab her and violently rip her out of the bed. Sometimes she would feel it while it was happening. Other times she would wake up when her body hit the floor. She was constantly covered in scratches and bruises, but again, she is obviously terrified. She doesn't think anyone is going to believe her. She did tell her mom and her brother, but at this point, no one really knows what to make of this. Now, at the same time this was happening to Diane, the son, Philip, was the first one in the family to actually see this entity. Now, for whatever reason, it was never in any of the bedrooms, and it was never seen when objects were moving or like when Diane was being attacked. But Philip said that he would always see this entity standing by the staircase. And it wasn't a typical way that you would describe a ghost or a spirit. It was very solid and very obviously a person of some kind, but also a shadow figure at the same time. And he said it would just stand there watching them and waiting. Now, the most unsettling part of this is the actual footage that someone has of this entity. And I think the creepiest part about this picture is how obvious it is what you are looking at. A lot of times when people say they've captured something on film, you kind of have to squint, kind of have to stare. This is very obvious what you are looking at. Now, paranormal researchers and investigators have said over the years that this photo is not doctored in any way. This is not Photoshopped. This is an actual real photo taken from the home. So at this point, with everything being so chaotic in the house, Jean, of course, decides to call in some paranormal investigators, some news reporters. She doesn't really know what to do at this point. And like I said, Jean was a single mother. I didn't get too much information doing my research, but I do not believe that they were in a position at that point to move. I think in stories like this, us as the outsiders always wonder why people stay in a situation like this, but I just don't think it's always a possibility for them to get out. Now, at this point, even though anyone that came into that house was experiencing and witnessing the activity, the kids were really the only ones seeing this entity. They described it as a human like figure that looked like a monk dressed in lots of long black robes. Now, like I said, at this point, anyone that came into that house was experiencing and witnessing whatever this entity was. There was a friend of the family that came and stayed the night, and they were also dragged from their bed, similar to what Diane had experienced. They landed on the floor after feeling something grab their ankles and rip them from their bed. And again, they did not see this entity, but they were covered in scratches and bruises. There was another guest that stayed at that house that witnessed an extremely heavy potted plant be picked up and hurled into the wall and smashed everywhere. I think because of this violent activity in the house, this is why people assumed this was a poltergeist that they were dealing with. But after years and years of research into this case, no one has ever been able to find out why this entity was presenting itself as a monk. At first, people assumed that this must be an evil spirit, perhaps a monk that died in a brutal way in that house, or the house was built on some sort of burial ground. Maybe there was a monastery nearby. No matter how people have searched into this case, they cannot find anything that would be even remotely connected to a monk. And so eventually, Jean and her children were able to move from that house. And the interesting thing with that is the activity in that household stopped immediately. There was never any reports of anything ever happening in that house again. Jean and her children never had experiences in any other places that they lived, so it didn't seem like there was something attached to them or something that followed them. And to this day, no one can really explain why what happened in that house happened and why it presented itself in the way that it did. I think stories like this are always a little more interesting to me than your typical haunting because, like I said, there's nothing connected to the entity or the being that is haunting that area. I find it more confusing when something presents itself as something else. And a lot of times I do understand if someone sees maybe a loved one that has passed and it's something more evil, pretending to be that loved one in order to communicate with this person or this person be more willing to communicate with them. But it's always a little confusing to me when something presents itself in another form that really has no connection to the people that it is communicating with. I definitely still have a lot of questions surrounding that story and would love to do some more research and maybe be able to do kind of like a part two or tell you guys if I find anything else out. But for now, that is the end of the first story, and we are going to jump right into the next one. Now, this next case begins in January of 1956. There was a 15-year-old girl named Shirley Hitchings who woke up one morning to find a silver key on her pillow. Now, this is an important detail because this key did not belong to any lock in the house. She had never seen this key before. She had no clue where it came from or what it went to. But after finding that key, that night is when some unexplainable noises started happening in her home. Now, these were not little noises. These were sort of shaking the house, and Shirley described it as coming from the root of the house, meaning it didn't sound like it was in the walls or coming from outside. It genuinely sounded like it was underneath the house. Now, these noises were so loud that the neighbors were complaining, thinking that Shirley and whoever was living in this house were the ones making the noise. Some people even compared these noises to the Blitz, like there was a bomb shaking the walls. To me, that is so terrifying to experience it, of course, in your home, but for something to be so loud that it's disturbing the neighbors, imagine how exhausting that alone would be to live with. But there was so much more happening inside this home. Now, in this house, it was not a quiet home to begin with. So Shirley lived with her family. There was her father, Wally, who worked for the London Underground. Her mother, Kitty, obviously also lived in this house, but she was wheelchair bound because of severe arthritis. And then also living with them was her grandmother, Ethel, and then her adopted brother, John. So this was a pretty full house to begin with. So things in this house started to escalate fairly quickly. The first thing that was noticed was sort of a knocking sound coming from the walls and then scratching. And then after that is when things picked up a little bit more. There were sheets flying off the bed. Someone described seeing a pair of slippers on the floor literally look like they were walking on their own. The clock was flying off of the wall by itself across the room. Chairs were moving across the floor, pots and pans were flying off of the counter. And the most terrifying thing of all is that Shirley's family members witnessed her being moved in her bed. Of course, after witnessing something as terrifying as that, the family could not ignore this or try to explain it away. Now, for whatever reason, eventually the family kind of nicknamed this entity Donald. And I'm not really sure why they picked that name or why they decided to name it, but a common theme in cases similar to this or cases with hauntings or poltergeists is people feel a little bit more comfortable if they give this thing a name. It's a little easier to try to confront or talk to if it feels more like a person and less like something that you can't see. But in this case, when they nicknamed this entity and tried to start communicating with it, what they didn't expect was that this thing would answer them back. Now, it wasn't talking to them out loud, but it was leaving them written messages. Now, some people claim that Donald lived in this house before them and he was angry that there was a family living in his house. At one point, one of the notes claimed that this entity was calling himself Louis Charles, which was a lost French prince, but historically that didn't check out. The most unsettling thing about that situation is not whether that information was true or not, but that whatever this thing was really trying to form its own identity. Of course, eventually investigators got involved, and this is where the case became more famous. And it became so noted because there were actual recordings from inside the home. So there is audio of the knocking sounds that the family was hearing. And there were even responses that were documented, and they were not random. It felt more like a conversation when they were communicating with this entity. And eventually it became so well known that local newspapers were reporting on this case. There were photographers constantly waiting outside, and even the BBC was trying to contact Donald on primetime television. The Battersea poltergeist was even discussed in the House of Commons, which is crazy to think about, the government discussing a haunting. Of course, people questioned the validity of this story. A lot of people thought that the daughter Shirley was doing these things for some reason. Other people suggested it was subconscious influence, where you sort of, are thinking about something enough that you believe you are witnessing certain things. But I think the thing that bothers me about this story, just like the previous story, is that whatever activity was happening inside the home never stopped when other people were watching. It stayed consistent no matter who came into that house, and it wasn't isolated to just the family. Now, with this story, just like the previous story, there wasn't some dramatic finale. There was really no neat ending. Things sort of started to die down when Shirley moved out in the late 1960s. But I think what makes that interesting is, was it Shirley that was doing these things, or was there something that was specifically targeting her that maybe was attached to her and left when she moved out, or it simply stopped because she was no longer there? I think cases like that are sort of open-ended are a little bit creepier than ones that kind of have a happy ending because you just can't make sense of it. And when you can't make sense of something like that, it makes your mind wonder, and it becomes a lot scarier when you think of all the possible things that could have been happening. I always find these sort of family hauntings and poltergeist stories very interesting because it always seems to happen to a family that has no history of anything like this ever happening before. They never have experiences or unexplainable events. It seems like it's isolated to one house and then it never happens again. It ends as quickly as it started. So let me know in the comments what you guys think of these stories. If you believe that maybe family members were fabricating these stories for attention or whatever your thoughts are. Also, if you follow me on Instagram and you have any unexplainable stories of your own, feel free to DM them to me. I would love to be able to read your stories in future podcast episodes. But for now, that is it for this episode. I appreciate you guys so, so much, and I will see you next time.